I miss my other chance to be a Vermonter. I'd like to welcome you all tonight. We have as good a crowd as last time. Apparently this is a fun thing everybody likes to be a part of, so we're really glad you're here. I'd like to introduce the members who have been active in the Historical Society this last year. You know who you are, and most of you are here. Will you simply stand up somewhere and wave so everybody can see who the members of the Historical Society are? These are the folks. Projects. I have to say, in all of my years of working with committees and boards, and I've done a few of them, this is by far the most hardworking and most interesting, and don't let you get away with a darn thing board that I've ever worked with. It's been wonderful. It's been a really enjoyable year. Just to give you a quick update on some things we've done. Well, this is our second Memories Night. It probably will not be the last. We have located equipment and a place to meet and to store items. The church, we thank the church for volunteering to be our initial depository for historical records and artifacts, and for a meeting place every second Monday of the month. We are grateful to a lot of people who have given us such things as copy machines and a couple of laptops and file cabinets and a whole variety of things we needed. So our expenses to date have been minimal. We have the business committee kind of put that stuff together. We have a group working under Paul Bouchou to do oral histories on the island, and several have been recorded already, and many more are in the works. And they will be in our permanent library. Alex Dunn has been working on a flyer for us, which we're going to have for some publicity. And we're just now ready with regulations and guidelines and all that we need to begin to receive stuff from your collections of historical memorabilia who would like to donate to the Society. The person who set it up is Nanette Cardin. Where is Nanette? Nanette is there in the room. She's there with a pad. And so we decided tonight, with the size crowd we anticipated, it would be too difficult to actually receive materials. But if you, before you leave, have materials you'd like to donate to the Society, see her, give her your name and phone number, and she and a committee of volunteers will meet with you to receive those items at a time and place of mutual agreement. It'll be a lot easier trying to do it here tonight. Okay. Some of the areas where we have specific needs, if anyone would like to get involved in the work of the Society, we need people in cataloging. We need people, especially right now, who will volunteer to help meet with people to receive donated items and to find out such things as, are they permanent gifts, or do they want photocopies, what do we have to do, how do we file them, all that kind of thing. There are procedures set up. We need people to do interviewing for oral histories. We need people to do transcriptions off of videos and tape machines. A tedious job, but somebody's got to do it. We can also certainly use some help in the area of projecting a couple of years' budgets, if people have some experience in that area, or fundraising, and of course the inevitable hosting and hospitality for events such as this. I would say that probably at this point, your donations of time, energy, and skill are probably the most valuable gift that you could give to us. In case you're so moved to donate generously a federal green, there is an old-fashioned, some kind of a pot. Jeff, what is that? Is that a milk bucket or what? It's an old milk pan, and that's our donation fund. It has historical value. So if you'd like to grace it with federal green tonight or a check, feel free to do so. We do have one fun fundraising event planned for this year, and this is kind of maybe the first time you're going to hear about this. We're going to do a scarecrow project on the island in the fall, 2 weeks leading up to Halloween. We're going to ask individuals, groups, family groups, groups on the island, artists, whoever would like to make a scarecrow. They're all going to be displayed all around Wynn's store, and if you donate them to the Historical Society, we're going to have a silent bidding for them, and that will benefit the Historical Society. So who knows, you may end up with a famous artist's original creation scarecrow for your garden. We think that'll be a fun project. Also, on the 18th of May, some Holiday Hideaway folks generated an idea over some liquid refreshments on New Year's Eve that became what is the first ever Holiday Hideaway Home and Garden Tour on the 18th. And that information is all about on posters, and tickets are available at the store and in town. And that will benefit both the ADA remodel bathroom here and the Historical Society. So you have ways to assist us. At this point, the main costs facing us in the coming year are going to be for acid-free folders to store things in and photocopying. Doesn't seem very glamorous, but it's fairly expensive to do that. Our annual meeting, first ever, is on a regular meeting night, the second Monday of the month. It'll be the second Monday of May, the 12th, at 7:30 at the church parish hall. At this time, we will have an election of officers, very brief reports, and some time in a roundtable sharing of historical.
I don't know how I got this duty. I guess that I'm the young old-timer here compared to these distinguished gentlemen here in front of us. But first of all, I think the Historical Society should get another big hand for all the work they're doing. I know this has been talked about for a long time, and talk is cheap, as they say. Yeah, so now the work begins, and I think that this group is really going to put it together, and so I think we should acknowledge them with another big hand. Well, tonight we have a distinguished panel of Islanders and former Islanders who are going to go over the old days, and I guess the old days now are getting back into the 20s and the 30s, so some of the memories I have are just like fresh, and so they, in case that comes up later, I think that we're going to hold this back into the 20s and 30s. But tonight, to discuss the villains, the robbers, the crooks, I don't know what else we're going to talk about. Tonight on my left is Jim Kager, Don Strom, Bud Strom, who are cousins, but not brothers, and Henry Hamill. And so I don't know how this is going to begin, but I think Bud has an idea. So I'm going to turn it over to Bud.
Thank you, Glenn. It's, before I forget to say something about it, I want to tell you why I think that you keep coming back. That food was about as good as you're going to find anywhere. Thank you, committee. And Bud, my namesake, who did the salmon, that was wonderful, Bud. That wasn't a little rainbow trout, that was a big king salmon. Thank you. It would be remiss on my part if I didn't say something about Glenn's brother, Gary. I think maybe it'd be appropriate to have a moment of silence for the loss of his brother. Would you do that with me, please? Thank you very much. When I heard that there was a conflict with this terrible tragedy and this forthcoming meeting, I thought maybe it would be postponed, but knowing the zeal, all the deals, that's kind of a play on words, that they would want to continue having the meeting even with the loss of Glenn's brother and Jan's son. I think that was very noble on your part, Jay, and thank you for that. A lot of memories in the Veal family in this place, and we'll talk first about some of the ones that go back, including my bit of the history. Our family came to Guaymas Island in 1917. All of the members of that group that came at that time are gone except for two cousins that Don and I have in Mount Vernon, Mamie Semf and Mirtha Hildren, who came on that first group of three families that came to the island. And I'm not sure whether they were on the Guaymas Ferry at that time or whether Rickaby's elk pulled them over on a scow. Nevertheless, that's when they came, and the Guaymas Ferry at that time was providing transportation for the workers at the shipyard. All of you know where the shipyard was? I think that's pretty well established down on the waterfront on South Beach, down towards the point. And that provided the means of their coming over. Then the ferry was abandoned, and the family that really gave the property to this site and to the church, it still has the property all the way down to the ferry, and where Win Anderson's store is, with Jack Kidd. Don has a picture of Jack Kidd, and for those of you that only can remember who that name was by some reading you have, well, many of us remember very well Jack Kidd. And some of you that don't remember him, he'll have a picture so you can see who the real Jack Kidd was. I read in the World Book before I came over the history of Prohibition. Why is Prohibition an important word to look up? Well, it provided one of the most colorful eras that this island has ever known. That goes from the 18th Amendment, which was passed by Congress and ratified by the states over the next 3 years, so that in 1921 approximately, there was no booze anywhere in the United States of America that could be sold, given away, or used in any way. Wrong. They forgot about Guaymas Island. Guaymas Island had provisions for being separated from the mainland by about a mile of salt water, lots of wooded property, most of which was level enough that you could either farm or build a still, and that still replaced or displaced most of the other forms of enterprises that could keep the people in the grub and food. And so moonshining became the #1 industry. For those of you that were around, you can see a little hyperbole there. I may have exaggerated a bit, but it was a very well-known enterprise. Now, how do you know about all that? Well, my connection with it was mostly by having heard some of the activities that go on indirectly. I was born in 1922, so if you wonder how young I am, I was born on October 3rd and 4th in October of 1922. Dr. Shaw came over and didn't fill out the birth certificate for the next day, so I had 2 birthdays, but nevertheless, that's all that. And so, I know something about it, but not old enough in that period of time, from 22 to 31, when the repeal of the 18th Amendment took place. Took place in 32, but the final work on it wasn't done until the repeal took place on December of 1933. So in 33, I'd only be 11, so I wasn't partaking too much Mountain Dew. You can understand the reason. So age was on my side. But on my left is a man that not only remembers those activities, but his family, if you'll pardon my taking the liberties, Henry, very much involved in moonshining. And he's going to tell you something about the stories of that, so we can branch out from it, since that was, like I say, that was really the #1 industry here. So Henry, I'm going to let you take over and tell all you know that you feel they can accept. And it's yours to tell about your dad's business there on West Beach. Here's Henry Hamill.
Schultz's cousin came to my dad and he says, I want to rent your house. He says, I gotta have running water and it's gotta have upstairs in it. So my dad says, okay, I'll run it to you. And they got water by pumping from a spring down by the beach. And that pumped the water up into the house for the still. Well, he had a couple partners, and I guess he never paid them very well. They all quit. So he talked my dad into going in with him. And so they built a big still, they had 350 gallons. They made whiskey by the barrel. They didn't sell it locally, it all went to retailers off the island. Of course, the old still was doing pretty good, and by golly, the guy went to sleep. They always distilled at night because they burned wood and counted the smoke. And he went to sleep, and the house caught on fire, and they lost the whiskey and the still. But at least when they had a 50-gallon barrel hid away out there. He had a lot of good whiskey for many years. And there was a lot of small stills on the island too. I think it was probably 5 or 6 of them. And they used to have one made out of a copper wash boiler, and they soldered the top on and put a hatch where you could put the mash in and then close it up. And they'd run that off the kitchen range. But they used to call that the jail door opener because that's about all they made enough to get in jail with. Well, one guy decided to make some prune brandy, and he had the old stiller going and he forgot to strain the prunes. One got up in the dome and plugged it and it blew up. It still blew up. So the prunes got in the coil there. And there were quite a few other stills on the island. It seemed guys made it mainly for their own use. But they never did stay too long because usually the sheriff or somebody caught up with them. I know one fellow north of the old where the schoolhouse used to be, he had a still down in the woods. Of course, he says, I come one day and here the sheriff has my still in his back seat. So I put him out of business.
Who was that in Mox Palm?
Mark Stromberg. So that's about it. I never did care for whiskey myself. I used to take a taste once in a while. But anyway, they use corn and rye for grain. And it got to be too hard to get rid of it. They'd feed it to the hogs and they'd get drunk. And they'd get a belly full and they'd get up and try to walk and they'd fall down and squeal. So they decided on another way. They used what they call corn sugar, and they run it into a cesspool underground so you couldn't smell it. And they used to buy their Fleshman's yeast in 1-pound blocks from the local bakery. My dad used to go to town with a team of horses and he hauled sugar over by the ton. And it seemed like we got about 9 or 10% alcohol out of a barrel of mash or a spill. So that's the way that goes. You had to have running water to cool your condenser because when you cook that stuff, it produces steam and then you condense it and that's what your whiskey is that comes out the bottom. You usually put it in charred oak barrels, which worked out real good. Now, when they first started, they didn't have anything to color it with, so they take sugar and brown it in a pan and dump that in the whiskey. And later they got going, they could buy coloring for it. But down south, I understand, they didn't have anything to color, so they used tobacco juice. I'll turn her back.
rid of them.
Wholesale it, the bootleggers.
Right, they were off island.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you sold it locally, you'd be in jail in a hurry.
Yeah. They came by and picked it up in a boat.
I delivered it mainly.
I have a tape that I cut by my cousin Don's brother, Art, who worked for Bill Beesner on the Bemis Ferry for years as a deckhand. Had a lot of Stroms. Don actually decked for him for a while, and Sandy Berenstain too, didn't you? Well, anyway, they did. And but Art, the older brother, and Ernie Hiller, another cousin, described to me, and Art in this little tape, how that which was delivered to this side. Bill Beesner would pay Art $5 for running the ferry over to this side. And he usually would run it after the last ferry, which was 5:30 in those days. So you people at least have a 6 o'clock on regular week. 5:30 was the last one. So Art would maybe come over for a run sometime between 5:30 and let's say 8 or 9 at night. And Zelvis would be down there, Zelvis Stone, the partner of Horace Amel, his dad, and Zelva would come down and deliver it to Art. Art would take it off the ferry, didn't even have to tie it up, just throw it on there, and he comes back to town and delivers it to the bootlegger. I guess that's what you would have said, or the retailer. Whoever it was, Art said, I didn't have anything to do with it. All I did was my delivery. Bill paid me $5, and that was the end of that. But that was one way it came to town. I often wondered if there wasn't a few boxes sometimes hidden in those loads of wood that came over, like maybe Bill Dolls or whoever. There was always a wagon load of wood coming to town. Either his dad or Bill Dolph or Louis Schultz had a load of wood. Morris back from the south. Louis Schultz wouldn't have had anything in there, but there's ways of putting things on the ferry, just like Art took it. It had nothing to do with the business, other than the fact that it was a means of getting it from there over here. But anyway, that's one of the ways it came to town, was the delivery system that Art Strom played a part in. Art also told me that if he came down on a regular visit, say that Zelva was going to come down and deliver it in the middle of the day, and either Bill Beesner, who was running the ferry, or Art would see that the sheriff was aboard, he would have a code system, and one whistle meant it's okay, there's no worries, but if it's two, maybe it'd be wise, Elvis, to turn around on the line and go back home again and fix the ferry. So that's all on this tape, and so if you don't believe me, you can believe the tape. And Marva, I wasn't trying to intimidate anybody with the fact that they were bootlegging or hiding contraband C25HOH on the ferry through a load of wood. I was just excited about all that activity took place. How did I know about it? We were a very strict family and didn't involve ourselves in alcoholic beverages at Christmas even, or New Year's, or any other time. But we would hear these parties down on West Beach. I mean, there were pretty good ones. I mean, by that, lots of yelling and fun. So they obviously, the material work that was, however, it was concocted and produced the proper effects. So once in the middle of the day, they were having one down at the old Kager place. Now the Kager place, that's Jim Kager's, this Jim's grandpa's place. The old Kager place on West Beach. And Walter Bergen had been living in that house, and there's a whole story we can go on Walter Bergen, and we'll embellish that one as the time goes by. But Walter was a consummate bachelor, but he had various lady friends that stayed there from time to time, and one of which was when he was living at this, we call it the Red House, down in the swamp area there, that land that was no good for anything, you know, down on the beach there, where you couldn't have given it away. Now it's only about, well, You can probably buy a lot there for $300,000 or $400,000 now. But anyway, that's where Walter was living. And for some reason, Leo Levesque got involved in this, and Leo was a fine citizen. But along with the Roy Freemans and the Strombergs and the Andy Forsters, they decided to have a daytime party in and around that red house down there where there's, I think the stone fireplace still shows on the outside of it. Do you have any idea what I'm talking about? It's about 10 houses north of the Eden Road as you come down from heading to the beach. As you curve down, and just about the time you would hit the trees or the pine trees down there, that was the old Kicker house. Pardon me? Oh, okay. Yeah, it was only a couple houses from where your place was there, Jay. Well, we're down at Johnson Bay swimming, which we did in July and August. And swimming meant that you would ride a log. You know, it's water's so cold in many places on West Beach, usually you don't do a lot of swimming, but the Strom kids and all the rest of us would go down there after we picked berries in the summer and we'd be swimming. And the word came that Leo Levesque has been shot. Leo Levesque's been shot, yeah. Who did it? Well, somehow it already got to us that Walter Bergen had done it. Well, we sneaked along the beach from the Johnson Bay. For the Johnson Bay, you don't know that name, it's where Bubbles lived in that general area. And Johnson owned that whole property up behind him, and he was murdered in 1912. And Bubbles was supposed to have seen it. And that's another story. But now we're coming back from this swimming trip. And the tide was out, about halfway, and so we were looking up over the logs, and sure enough, there was activity up there around the house. And in fact, Leo had been shot, and Leo went to his grave with one eye out. He didn't get him, and they always felt that honeysuckle vine that was located on the side of that, the old Kager place, was the thing that saved Leo's life. But Walter was found up in the trees, and was hiding in a stump up there at the head of the swamp, about half a mile up in there, and he spent the next, how long, Don?
A year and a day.
A year and a day in jail for that. Well, it's hard to prove anything other than the fact that they had eyewitnesses and maybe a few other things, but that's where Walter Bergen spent the next year or so, and we witnessed it. Now, that could have been a murder, but it wasn't. It was attempted murder, I guess, because he was just trying to scare them off so they wouldn't use that place for a party any longer, because he felt he had squatters' rights on. That's probably all he had, and so he was living there at the time. So that's the way it goes with Walter Bergen. And I'm going to let Don take over and explain a little bit more about maybe what he remembers about Walter, and I'll go into some more. And if you can think of any seedy things that they apparently came here to hear about, we'll go into that later. This is Don Strom, my cousin.
Thank you, Bob, but I don't know too much about Walter, but I know that he had a habit of the 4th of July. He had 2 anvils. He used to put a stick of powder on top of one of them and put the other one on top of it, blast the anvils. Made a heck of a lot of noise. And then another time he was catching fish out there. My brothers were trolling with a skiff, and he was out there trolling with a skiff. And he's catching fish, and my brothers aren't catching anything. And he wouldn't tell him what he was using, and finally, a couple of years later, he finally did tell him it was what they call a Largo wobbler. But he wouldn't tell him at the time when the fish were hitting it. But he finally, I don't know why, but he finally committed suicide. He hung himself. And that was one of the
I was just, thank you, Bob. I was just handed by Carol a little rundown on Walter Bergen, as was transcribed by Marv. Was this, that's where it came from?
Yeah, he had me write it down.
Well, Marvin shows who spent the winter in Phoenix, and here he is. Just got back in time, didn't you, Marv? Where are you standing here? Marv, you should be up here. In fact, Henry would love to have you give him some support. You sure you don't want to come up and join us?
Right.
I'd like to have you. Marvin, as you know, along with Jim Caker, is the one of two people who have continuously owned property from that time of the 20s until now in the same family. I mean, there aren't too many that can say that. Some of us are still around, but to think that Marv is living on the old Louis Schultz place that was there when I was a little baby, and Jim is living on the old Jim Cager place. It's really kind of exciting to know that we have these two resources of information that went on. Do you want me to read this, Marv?
You read it.
He almost made us promise that he wouldn't have to get up and say something. So here's the post log on Walter Bergen, a man who was named Walter Bergen. See, you didn't think we were telling the right story. Was not well liked by the island people. He treated he threatened Louis Schultz. He had a small cabin on North Beach near the old Lewis place. He was found hung by the neck. Well, the Lewis place, I don't know if you know where that is. Do you know where? Who is? Who is it? Butch Krieger, you're here, Butch. Okay, now you know where that. The Lewis place was where Butch lives now, but up above that was the old Lewis place. Carrie, you went up that hill right off of the main, whatever you call the North Shore Drive, and up there above that, that was Lee Lewis's folks' place. And Walter had gotten a hold of that place, and that's where he met his maker, right there, hung by those rafters. Well, we're all created by our maker. But that's where he was found, hanging there. And it says so right here. It was a what's that? It was a presumed suicide. So we even have the intrigue of the fact that it could have been helped. And there are people that probably would have enjoyed that process as well. It somehow came out in the press that it was a suicide, and most of us had to agree with that conclusion. The Levitt girls went there to look for their cows. We always let our cows run free. Their word fences were hard to keep up, and particularly if you didn't own the property, it was not fair to put up fences. Well, we ran our cows down almost to the Indian village. See, there was no houses after Bubbles. That was the end of civilization. So as you went down towards Clark Point and around the North Beach, that was all free-range country for the cows, and so that's where they were.
Because that was where the spring was and the cattle watered there.
You get all that? There was a spring at the Indian village, and so the cattle could get a little water, and so consequently, if you turned them loose down there, you had a freebie. You had water plus grass. They looked in the window and discovered Mr. Bergen hanging dead. So that was the end, the demise of Walter Bergen, whose dog was Brownie, had a little Boston bull called Brownie. He'd come up to our house because he seemed to like my mother's cookies and things that went with it. And he'd sit there and roll his Bull Durham. I can still see him so often. And people thought he was 2 or 3 cards short of a full deck, but he still seemed to be able to keep women around. In fact, Mrs. Dewar was the midwife when I was born, along with Dr. Shaw. And according to history, my sister, who is now gone too, said that, oh, he's just a little rosebud. That's where I got my name, Bud. I said it was because my Norwegian friends couldn't say you yin. This is another story on it. A man. Okay, real estate man, Guimas.
Do you want me to read it?
On Guimas Hill, picked up a hitchhiker
Oh, I think he's got it
and
now.
brought him to the island. The hitchhiker wanted to go back to Anacortes. They got into an argument, and the hitchhiker killed the real estate man. Pretty good argument, I'd say, right there. The man tried to hide the body under some old driftwood. The LaRue boys came by, discovered the body. Dead Man's Cove. There were other bodies there also that also ended up in this area. This is bona fide. The place came to be known as Dead Man's Cove. Where's Dead Man's Cove now? Cook's Bay. Now we knew it was Cook's Bay. The Colberts lived there, and Don will talk about that because he knows the O'Briens, some of the earliest of pioneers here, and the Colberts were related to him. It's down here to my left along the shore, and that was the O'Brien place.
You want me to read it?
Okay. These are pretty good stories right here. I'm enjoying this if you don't. Ed Kelly was bootlegging. Ed Kelly, I'm sorry to say, Jim, was a relative of yours. Well, ours too, because John Kelly married Don's sister Edmund. So John and Ed were uncle and nephew. So it's all part of the family here. We've got to join it together. Ed Kelly was bootlegging in the bootlegging business. Well, see, there's one more that you didn't know about, Henry. The bootlegger came in by boat to load their booze. Came to load their booze, to unload their booze kegs. One box they came in on, or one day they came in on front of Bubbles' house. She went out with an axe and busted up their kegs. Now what are kegs? What are they? Busted their kegs, okay. She might have busted something else too. The bootleggers burnt down her house. She knew one of them was Ed Kelly and went after him for revenge. She strapped on her grass.
Her guns.
Her what?
Guns. Her guns.
Oh, strapped on her guns and went to
Gold bar. Gold bar.
Gold Bar, Washington. Well, she made quite a trip.
Bud?
To get him. She was asking for him, and he got the news that she was hunting for him, and he skipped town. Well, I would think so. In about 1930, this is another story, I think, from it. Maclaw, then Zelda Stone. Well, I mentioned Maclaw, and Horace Hamill were in the bootlegging business. They are still south of Louis Scholl's barn. They caught the woods on fire. The fire spread to many acres behind the farm. Louis Schultz had to put a backfire in order to stop and save his home and property. That's a different one from the burning down the house of yours, though, Henry, isn't it?
Yeah.
So There was a little arson mixed in with this too, obviously. But he had one murder that I didn't even know about. You guys listen, because we may get the wrong stories here, and then we'll be liable. We'll be liable. Johnson was murdered in 1912. I've got to go back and straighten out this thing with bubbles. And how many new bubbles in here? How many new bubbles? All of the same one. She was Bubbles when she was younger, and she went from plural to singular about 25 years before she died. It was always Bubbles when we were young. She didn't look very good when she was young, and I often wondered about that Bubbles look. She got better as she got older, actually. She died when she was about 95, plus or minus 2 or 3 years, depending upon who you talk to. But I have a tape that she cut along with, I've got these 2 tapes, one by my cousin Art and one by her, almost about the same time, telling me the whole story on the death of Old Man Johnson. Old Man Johnson's legacy is that we still call the bay down there Johnson Bay. And he owned about 20 or 30 acres up behind that with a beautiful orchard on it and a lot of things, and he was known to have quite a bit of gold. Gold was and still is an important item. If you haven't any, it's important, and if you do have some, you hide it oftentimes, and that's what he did. There was a fellow from town with his son that lived out towards Trafton, so if you know where the lower canneries are in town, that according to Dr. Ron Pinson's great aunt, Dorothy, who told me this story personally, that her daddy said, don't ever go down there by that man's house because he is not a nice man. Well, that nice man worked for Jim Burrow, who used to cut timber bolts or shingle bolts over here in that period of time, around 1910 to 19 teens. And this man worked for him. And he also heard the clippings about Mr. Johnson having buried gold. And so, apparently, on one of his trips over here, they decided that they would take care of Old Man Johnson. And apparently that's what it was. Bubbles says she saw it because she was visiting with her aunts over here. She was Henrietta Blaisdell in those days, of her aunts, I think. Isn't that quite a name, Blaisdell? That's what Bubbles was when she was young. And so she would have been probably single-digit age and saw these men throw the body of Old Man Johnson in the Bellingham Channel. And so she apparently knew that there was gold around there, and so in those years that she lived and went through, you know, Burger Berlin and Johnny Irvine and Finley, Doc Finley, and the rest, she said, well, Bud, how do you think I got along? And I don't know, Bubbles. Well, she said, they got that gold around here, and I get little bits here, little bits there, and there's some up there. In fact, I'll show you where it is. So she drew a map kind of out for me, which is described on this tape, which I hope I find. It's still a pretty good commodity. The trouble is, it's right under the macadamized road as you make the turn off of West Shore and start up the hill there. And the county decided to pave over that particular area. So if any of you do that, you better do it in a hurry as we get more higher tech backhoes, if you could do it in a hurry and refill it again. Jeff, I don't know if you're... I can tell you where it is, we can split. You know, Barb knows where it is too. Okay, well, that's 3 of us, 3-way split. But that man, whose name I won't dare give out because there may be some relatives, became under spiritual conviction of his bad life, of murdering is kind of bad. And when the Salvation Army was located down where the old Seroptimus building was on on 4th and O. They had meetings in there, and he went in and confessed to them as he became a Christian in his dying days, because he gotten cancer, and spilled the beans that he was the one that killed Old Man Johnson, 1912. Apparently Dr. Brooks, that's Tom Brooks' daddy, he got the same message from this same man because he'd come to him for some medical help. But that's kind of an interesting story. So Edward R. Murrow's cousin, Jim Murrow, who was the owner of the Shingle Bolt Company that hired this murderer from the Lower Canaries in Anacortes, shot Old Man Johnson and confessed at his deathbed. So it was a solved mystery, even though, and all that went on, and Bubbles got involved in it, just like she did so many other things. But anyway, that's the end of the Old Man, the Johnson theory. In case any of you have any other more enlightening facts on it, be sure and tell the committee so they can know about Old Man Johnson. These were interesting stories, by the way, Marv, and I'm glad that you got back to enlighten us. That murder there of the hitchhiker, I'd never heard about. Do you know anything more about that than what's written there?
No, I don't.
We're getting long answers here. Jim, I'm sure Jim Kager has some clues on what he knows about Walter Burgett, and we all seem to be homing in on him. But Jim, it's good to talk to you, and I hope I haven't spilled any beans. Here's our Jim Kager.
Thank you. I'm not really good at speaking, but what I have heard here is quite a bit of it is new to me. Folks had a farm up there at the middle of the island, which I'm on now, and we just didn't get around to get much of that gossip. So what's been going on here tonight is fairly new to me. I've heard some of it. But the way I heard it, where Walter Burgett had hung himself, it was the Dolphs that lived up on the old Lewis place. And they used to walk to school. They seen him hanging in the window there, through the window. They could see him hanging there for a couple of days. Finally, they got curious to see what happened. Why they were in the same place all the time. That's the way I heard it. Harold Dolph, and there was, I think, Wally is the only one that's left of the kids. He's up in Alaska. But Ben and Wally, Ed, Eddie, Helen, they're all passed away.
Thank you, Jim.
That's about it, so.
There's nothing wrong with that conclusion, and obviously, two people can report on the same accident, and not come up with the same conclusions. We were of that age that we were still too young to get involved in a lot of this, so we had to get information from somebody else about those early days of moonshining. But some of the other ones, with Walter Burgess demise, besides hiding in the stump and being found up there, one of his sweethearts was a lady by the name of Mrs. Fuller. Mrs. Fuller lived in the Kimball place on where Marv has been farming, just above Al Bush's Black Angus farm. The next one up, just in front of where Loganberry John had his place. Turkey Sherman had his farm a little farther up. Well, the Kimball place was a big two-story of an old kind of a Cape Cod type, and a very nice place. And Mrs. Fuller chose to do what with it, Marvin?
Burn it down.
Arson again. No, here's just ready to go. Let's talk.
She had set the place on fire, and about that time, my dad was coming from town with after he delivered a load of wood. And she had all her furniture outside. At the time, my dad figured he could have put the fire out, but she kind of stalled it, so. But anyhow, he loaded the furniture on and took it down to this Walter Bergen's place. And then she finally got religion and confessed that she had burned the house down. So that's how my dad bought it from the insurance. And then my dad, when he passed away, had sold the property to me. That's it about it.
What's that for? I knew that's the way it was, and I knew that she had gotten religion in that process, and so, but here you found the people that were involved directly with her. So there's two cases where religion has done some good for a few people. So, I happen to be a believer, but I mean, it's kind of interesting how these things can come about. Such extreme. With Mrs. Fuller, I can remember her very well, and I remember when it happened, but I didn't know that you folks were involved in it that heavily. Don Strom was very involved in some of the early families that should be remembered in any book that you would be writing, and it doesn't make it necessarily shady, but it makes it something that would be good reading material. He lived with the Colberts for a while, who were related to the O'Briens, one of the first families on the island. And I think, Don, you should tell us a little bit about that, a little bit of history relating to the O'Briens and the Colberts.
Well, Humphrey O'Brien, he had a place over at Cypress in Secret Harbor. He cleared that all out, planted a big orchard, and then he sold it to another guy and moved over to Weemus. And this is way back in the 1800s. And he was married to a Native American gal, or part Native American, and he bought a homestead way down on South Beach, right for that first kind of little bay, and then it goes out again, you know. He bought that from Matthews, as part of the Matthews estate. And so he done some logging and mostly piling and stuff there, and everything was going along pretty good. And anyway, this Ellen Wooten, her husband had passed away, and but a little later, old Humphrey's wife passed away, and anyway, Ellen is buried up in the cemetery up here, and O'Brien's first wife, I'm not positive where she's at, but I think she's buried behind the house that O'Brien had down there and out by his barn. But there's houses all over through there. I looked. Maud, his wife's name was Maud, it was Ellen's daughter. And he was an Englishman, and he was helping O'Brien up there logging, and they ran some cattle. But he wouldn't let them live up in the house. They had to have a shack down on the beach down there. Well, then finally Humphrey up and died one day, and he's buried up here too, the cemetery. And so Maud and Bill moved up in the house with Ellen O'Brien. And Mrs. O'Brien, she couldn't speak English, all Indian. And of course her daughter Maud could speak Indian too. Anyway, shortly after that, well, or a few years after that, well, Ellen, or Maud died. She's up in the cemetery up here. And so Bill took care of Ellen for years. She was bedridden up there, and she finally passed away. But it's pretty interesting because I had a lady from Ferndale get a hold of me, and she's the daughter of the first Mrs. O'Brien. And she was wondering as to her whereabouts. And I told her I don't know. There's no trace of her up here in the cemetery or any other cemeteries in Skagit County that I know of. And so that's about all I can come up with on that. But they used to have an awful time if Bill Covert and his wife would go to town for a day or so. The old lady O'Brien was still able to walk around and stuff. Maybe I've mentioned this before, but they'd be in town, and some of her relations knew they'd went over on the ferry, so they'd wait till evening and row down there with a skiff. And then they'd knock on the walls and hoot like an owl, and the old lady would grab a blanket and run up the road, because that was bad luck and somebody was gonna die or something. Sit on a log up there all night long. Meantime, these guys are picking up all her canned stuff and fried stuff. Taking it back home with them. But she was quite a gal, really. I couldn't talk to her, but I'd have to go through Bill Covert to interpret it, you know. But she'd always give you good answers, and what else do you think about that?
I think that kind of covers some of that early history. There may be questions that will come relating to some of that early history, and here's a resource. As I was thinking about what our format would be, besides the shady materials, which you pretty well covered, we'll have him come back and tell a little bit about Bud Hansen's demise. Now, that lists three suicides that we've had, and Bud was one of the more dramatic ones. How many of you remember Bud Hansen? Well, see, it's not that many, but it wasn't that many years ago that he left these premises. He lived in a Wanigan. You know what a Wanigan is? It's kind of a little scow with a cabin on it, about 200 yards east of the ferry landing on the beach. And very talented person until Don will talk about him in just a little bit. But I want to go down through a few of the families and names, and if I were writing that book, I'd want to include them in it. The Blackington family, are there any Blackington members here? Is Mildred Dunn or anything? The Blackingtons were, we would have called half-breeds. A beautiful family of a mixture of either Samish and Caucasian, or they even had some Caribbean ancestry, didn't they, Don?
Yeah.
Anyway, they weren't strictly the combination of what we called the Indians in those days. Beautiful family, and they lived down, Chet Blackman lived down on just down close to the ferry dock. They had a large family: Maxine, Newsfield, Florence, Lully, Chet, Earl, Mildred. Earl was in my class, and Chet, probably the most talented athlete that's ever come off of Weemus Island. He played baseball and football and starred. He just didn't play at Anacortes High. He graduated, I think, in 1936. But he was one good athlete. So if anybody talks to you about Sonny Blackington or Earl or Chet Blackington, you'll know, yeah, I remember where he was. And also, he was the only one that I knew could beat up on Bill Backoff. Bill Backoff was right, Henry?
Yeah, he was a tough guy.
Yeah. The Backoffs were a Russian family, like Teklikov or whatever, and Bill came with those Russian genes and loved to fight, and somehow people would put them together, and I saw some pretty tough ones out at the ferry dock. It seemed like either out here in front of the hall or down, we call it the hall, this is the hall, and out the ferry dock, so okay, out the store. And somewhere somebody started a fight some way, and so those two would be put together. And of course I was always playing for Chet because he was the All-American boy. Bill Backoff was the black hat. And anyway, remember the Blackington family, and the Backoff family is interesting because Harry Kanacki married a Backoff. Isn't Harry Kanacki, is that an interesting name? It's Harry Kanacki. Well, Harry Kanacki was married to Irma Backoff, I think was her name, and she died.
No, she divorced it.
Oh, is that what it was?
Married her mother.
That's my punchline. How many people you know marry your mother-in-law? I live right up the road here, about 150 yards, just past the merchant place. That was Harry Kanacki's place. But anyway, that was kind of an interesting story about Harry Kanacki. I don't know much more about him, and he had an interesting name. Everybody should know about George Kingston, who was the self-appointed mayor of this island, and also it hurt you if I said Siwash. I mean, we call it, that's like calling an Italian a walk, but and you don't do that unless you is one. You don't call a person Dog Islander unless you're from Dog Island. And George was a wonderful man, and Sarah, his wife, were longtime residents on the main drag here, and so colorful, so wonderful, such a wonderful guy. The family was great. They lost Dutch, their boy, in World War II. Anyway, she'd always remember him. Earl Cahill was here last time, and gave his history, and he's colorful in his own right. He might not have said all that he deserved, but his dad built the gates into the cemetery, Indian Cemetery, just wide enough for a Model T Ford, as you can see. And I work sometimes for Evans, and it's a challenge to make that coast, make that turn in through that gate. But that was the times that they did things. Earl was a good carpenter, and so anyway, the Earl that you saw here, his son, that's a very colorful family. Turkey Sherman lived up by the ferry, by the school, and Turkey was Sam Sherman, but he was called Turkey Sherman because he raised turkeys. That's the only reason. You know any other reason why he was called Turkey? He had some nephews that stayed with him, the Allen boys. They lost 3 of them in World War II out of one family. You'll see it on a memorial at the Causland Park in Anacortes. We had a lot of losses in World War II. And of course, World War I was Harry Causland from across the road here. The Causland family, that's the Frank Causland that lived there, the father of Harry. And the other Causland, Herb Causland, was our mailman. He was the mailman the entire time that I was going to school, up until I got through the 8th grade. And first they would go down around Kelly Point and come around in front of Henry Hamill's place above the bank. And then time and erosion took care of that road because the bank slid in, and then they moved the road over this way, and that became the new road. The new road. WPA built that road in the middle 30s, and so Henry had an entrance to his farm from the back, and then he built across the road from it. So the federal government took care of the access to his. He was landlocked before the WPA came along. Nevertheless, that's the way that road came in. So all of a sudden, I got on a rabbit trail here before Harry's place. Was it? Oh, the families. Yeah, there we go. Causland, yeah. And the other place was where Herb Causland lived was where the Beals place was, down on Eden Road. So that's where you first moved, wasn't it, Jay, when you came to town? So that was the Causland place to start the strawberries on this island. My folks said strawberry. The Showalters, we got to talk about Gordon Showalter a little bit because he went to Broadway and was a tap dancer, and we're going to call it Sissy Showalter. And he and I found a dead man up in the village. And my brother went down to investigate after Gordon had convinced my mother that this man that we found on the beach in this skiff was dead, and that Mrs. Strom, he's been dead for at least 2 days, she said to my mother. Okay, rang on the phone, the coroner came over, and I saw it come down past Bill Dolph's place, that's just below Marv's house, and the hearse went back to the ferry. And here's Gordon and I, who were going to be heroes, and my brother came in. I said, how come the ferry? They went, why did they go back to the ferry? He said, well, George Stevenson was just waking up when I went down there to see him. George was a jitney man for Anacortes Lumber and Box, and he would take those Rickaby's boats and always took a little bit of what do we call it? Some kind of honey-do with him, and he got a little bit too much so he couldn't row. He just pulled the skiff in and take a canvas and put over the top, and there Gordon and I found him. But George Kingston never lived that down. He said to me, buddy, thought he dead man lately, because Mercury said, the boys find dead man. Dash, dead drunk. We were 11, you don't often find a dead man, and that was, we talked about the Lewises, we talked about crippled Jimmy. We were cruel when we described people. There's crippled Jimmy, and he's crippled, right? Physically impaired. He lived down there where Bud Hanson's, in that same area where Bud's shack was. And there was crippled Jimmy. So crippled Jimmy, Turkey Sherman, Loganberry John, and Wiggy Dolph named most of these. They were a cousin of Marv, a very talented young man that died of Wiggy Dolph, died as a 9th grader, but he had named or renamed almost everybody on the island at the time. And so Per Rolfe, Clarence Rolfe is still Per Rolfe, Horsey Hamill is still Horsey Hamill, Curly Cahill is still Curly Cahill, Earl Curly. Olive, my cousin, became Poggy, Pollywog, Poggy Strong. I was Putty Mints because it was like Putty. On and on, but he had a name for everybody. And all he has left of the nomenclature of Boogie Dolph, and that's all. This is Mark Schultz.
Getting back to this dead man that was found. Well, he finally died. And then the sheriff and the coroner was going, it had just nothing but a trail then to get to his place. And so the sheriff said to the guy, that guy, SOB, better be dead this time. You know he's gonna be dead.
Thanks for that. It was a long trip over from Malvern and the corner, especially ferry, probably cost $5 or $6 then, probably, I think it's very Charlie Forsyth of Forsyth's Pond, and how many learned to swim in Forsyth's Pond? You probably don't even know where Forsyth's Pond is. It's on Eden Road down towards the old Bill place. Still a pond there. It's about as long as from here to the door, and many of us learned to swim there. But that was old Forsyth, and the cause was taken care of. While I'm looking out and seeing all this ferry business, I'm reminded of two gentlemen that are over here on my starboard side, your port side. Sons of the Gilkeys, of the Gilkey Brothers Towing Company. They are real pioneers, and they live on North Beach now, part-time. Good friends of mine, were good friends until I'm doing this. But their daddy, Bill Gilkey, was a very close friend of Bill Beesner's, who ran the ferry until in the 40s, I guess, from 1970 to 1940. And so they rode the ferry back many times. I'd see them. They were good friends of the whole Beesner family. Why don't you rise and be recognized? Mark on the left and Charles on the right. If you want to know anything about tugboat history on Puget Sound, talk to those men. Gilkey Brothers Towing Company was the largest towing company on Puget Sound in those days because of all the mills here and all the logs being towed around, and there's the offspring of them, two very wonderful people, good friends. Getting back to the last hanging, no, it was a shooting, and we're related to this gentleman, and so we can freely talk about him, and one of the more talented people that I've ever known, and I'll tell this because it's easier for my telling it than it is for Don, perhaps. He was Don's full-blood cousin, came from a very educated family, and his mother died early in life, and so he was raised by a stepmother. Now, stepmothers sometimes carry the traditional Cinderella type of bad stepmothers, and others are wonderful, but this was in what appeared to be not very nice, and Bud was inclined to have trouble with that stepmother. He even came to live with my uncle and aunt on West Beach when he was in his teenage, and chose during the period of time there to find some money because he was literally kicked out of the house and carved himself a little gun out of a piece of wood and held up a service station in Olympia and was put in Walla Walla for X number of years for what somebody would have slapped their hands. I think he got about $1.25 and got across town.
He didn't get that far, he got about a block and a half.
And anyway, that was the way that some of you know him as being kind of the South Beach drunk. He had a problem with alcohol. But if you knew that whole history, and the family has got a brother who had a PhD in biochemistry, I think it was, and so they were very talented, but getting off on the wrong start in this case ended up being a disaster. He called me about 5 minutes before he chose to end things, and I called Don because I wanted something to take care of him. If it hadn't been for Win Anderson back there, we probably never even would have known anything. Win, you were absolutely wonderful in what you did to help Bud out at that time. Don, why don't you tell about what you saw and why you think that Bud may have done what he did?
Well, he gave me a call one day, and he said his boy was coming up to visit, and he was, I had all of his guns over at the house because he'd been in the hospital, and so anyway, Bud, the next day, well, his kid showed up and visited with him, and later on that day I got a call from Bud. The boy had evidently brought him up a bottle, and after the kid left, he says, you know, I'm not going to make it through the night and all this here stuff, you know. I said, Bud, I'm just about ready to sit down to eat. I said, I'll give you a call back in about 20 minutes. So I did, no answer. And called again, no answer. Next thing I know, well, here's Win on the phone. He says, I just wanted to tell you that Bud just shot himself. Oh, God. So Deputy Sheriff came over and they took care of the remains and everything. And so anyway, he had cremation, and his ashes are down on the beach down there where he lived. But Bud was, it was a real waste because Bud was a master ship's carpenter, all-time tinkering, went around with outboards and building something. But like Bud said, he was a lush. And for a while he lived out by the State Ferry dock out there. And one day, or one night, he came by the police station when it was on 12th there in the fire department. And we had a big bell out there in front. And the cops looked out and they seen Bud out there messing around with his bell. And they said, what are you doing? Oh, I was just kind of measuring it and looking at it. And he says, where's the clapper for it? And they said, it's put away. Why don't you get the heck out of here and go on home and sleep it off? Okay. So Bud left. This is about 1 o'clock in the morning. So about 5 o'clock in the morning, well, here's Bud. Came in and asked the dispatcher where the cops are at. So she called a couple of them in. They said, Bud, what do you want, Bud? Well, I don't want nothing. Well, what we could call in here for then? Well, he says, you were so curious to know what I was doing at 1 o'clock in the morning. Like I'm doing at 5 o'clock in the morning. And another time he was catching the ferry, and of course he was walking on the railroad tracks there by the ferry dock on the other side and drinking beer. Somebody called the cops. Well, they came boiling down there. You can't drink in public. And they were going to pinch him. But he threw the bottle down on the railroad tracks and broke it. And he says, there goes your evidence. But all the time doing something like that. going down to catch the ferry, and sure he got a drunk driving ticket on the way down to the ferry. And after this was all over, well then, the cops were wondering where he's at. And I said, well, you can't write him a ticket to, to a guy that's passed away. That took care of that. But like I say, it was a real waste because he was a real good carpenter. And radical as heck, but he was quite a guy, really.
What was his name?
Alton D. Hansen. Yeah.
I'm named after him. My middle name is Elton, and I gave a nickname of Bud, so.
His middle name is mine.
Okay, so anyway.
No. His middle name is.
No? Okay. Well, anyway, he was a great man, and he called me his famous last words, Bud, I'm dying. And that's when I called Don. So anyway, that is the climax of all the greasy, grisly parts of what we remember. There's lots of wonderful things that have happened to this island, and we know those too, which you may want to hear about, but that isn't very newsworthy. Glenn, you have a question.
Well, I just wanted to say one thing about Bud Hansen. The one thing I remember most is that in this cabin that he built on the beach, these shavels that went this way and then this way, and I think Wynn has got a building like that he patterned after this building that Bud lived in there, because he lived in those little shacks first, then he built this bigger home that one time high wind and high water lifted this thing up and took him out to sea. And he was going down towards the pad, and I remember he wrote it out. I've got pictures of him out there. I maybe Wynn does too. But this building, he wasn't going to abandon this thing. He wrote it out, and then I don't remember who saved him, but they towed it back in.
He told me about that. A sou'wester with a high tide was just about to do it to him, and he had drums under there that would give him flotation. And he'd bring it up normally on those piling, but once the tide came in over those verticals, he was floating, and if the floating was taking him down towards Colbert's place, that's where he went. He was one of the first self-contained mobile units that I've ever seen. Within about 6 feet, every function you wanted to do would take place. Wynn?
I'd just like to say a few things. The Wanigan that Bud built was one of the most incredible structures I've ever seen. It was built with split cedar log. So the lengths of the planks were anywhere from 8 to 12 feet long, absolutely vertical grain, clear cedar. And they were fitted together so tight that he could live in there and heat it with a wood stove, and there was no insulation, no other siding, just these 3/4 inch to 1 inch planks that they split. Now, Bud had 2 houses down the beach, you may not remember that, but one of them was the Wanigan, which was actually built on boom log, and that's the one that floated down. And every time we got a big storm, even from the southeast, that Wanigan would rock and roll. It was just so tight that it was just incredible. But he helped me out many times, because I used to row across the channel 4 or 5 days a week and leave my boat there, my rowboat there. And he had, as you know, someone explained, he had a shop in that Wanigan, he had his kitchen, everything all set up, and we've got some photographs that we're running on that. But he also had a reserve house further up the beach, just about the high tide line, a little above. And what happened was kind of tragic, and I think it was probably the reason that he finally did himself. And by the way, I wouldn't put the bottle that he got on his son, because there was another visitor there that day that shall remain unnamed, who provided, we pretty sure provided the gun, and they had provided the bottle too. But anyway, Armstrong that just bashed inside of that building, and tools and everything just went out into the beach. And we had some people over there from the rowing club and that helped, and some other friends there that helped pick things up. But that hurt him real bad, and he moved up into his reserve house, further up the beach, and that's where he committed suicide when he just saw that it was futile, that he would never be able to put his shop back together. Well, the reserve house, a fellow by the name of Bob Porter, I don't know if he's here tonight, but Bob came by, I hired him and his crane, and we lifted the reserve house out, and I skidded it down the road and put it back in my field, and it sat there for several years until it was finally, I had a chance to restore it. And if you look down in front of the store, there's this little boathouse, and that is Bud's old reserve house. It's got the corner crib size, and I put a roof on it, and I believe the flooring for that came out of the old schoolhouse, the way Bud explained it to me. So that's a little bit of history that you should know about.
Thank you, Win, that was very good. One little correction from last meeting was that I doubted Carol's memory, that's Marv's daughter, about the shake mill that was located on Eden Road just above Marv's place. And now I remember it was there. I don't know if you do or not, but Carol, you're right. There was a little shake mill in there. We were talking about industry and wood products, etc. And I couldn't remember. Now I do. Anyway, I don't think, unless there are some questions you'd like to ask the panel, the time is drawing late, and I appreciate that. So, except Jeff, you have one quick.
Yeah, one quick one. Down there, Cook Cove, Dead Man's Cove. What kind of mill was that down there? When was it going?
What kind of what?
Mill or whatever it was that was going down there. You can still see the remains of,
Shake mill where now?
Well, I don't know if it was a shake mill or what sort of mill it was. It was down there where the boat ramp is in Holiday Highway. But it was so cool.
You're talking about that big foundation now?
Yeah.
Right. That was a barn.
A barn.
I think. It belonged to,
That's the Lomans we were talking about?
no, it belonged to President Jenny Pinio at one time.
Okay, it was never a
And they
commercial.
moved inland.
Anyway, worked out with these people. We appreciate your listening to us, and I hope that it wasn't too boring for you. And we'll do something like this in other areas of interest if you want us to do it. Give us a little lead time. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question, Marvin and Henry, about how they took the teams across the ferry to town. How did that?
Used to drive them right on the ferry.
Used to drive right on the
But
ferry.
later years, they prohibited any horses on the end, be hauled in a trailer.
One of the more interesting things was an observer watching either Louis Schultz or Bill Dolph on a low tide in the summertime, which is always in the summertime, go up on the opposite side of those aprons. And they usually left the little droppings along the way up there. It's even kind of noisy, but I mean, that was a thing to watch because they were spooky too. The docks and the bridges to them weren't as firm as they are now. And so anyway, it was quite a thing to see, right?
My dad would always wait for high tide before he'd ever go across.
Well, obviously that was Bill Dolph that was doing it at low tide. I didn't see it. Now I saw in person, but it was quite a thing to see. So usually they went at high tide, so they could go right on. Thank you for all the time you were giving.